Welcome to this module of Professor Messer's free Microsoft 7680 certification training course. I'm James Messer, and in this module we're going to look at installing Windows 7 in a dual boot installation. This comes from our requirements from our Microsoft 7680 Configuring Microsoft Windows 7 exam, where we're going to talk about installing, upgrading, and migrating to Windows 7, specifically performing a clean installation, where this installation may include but is not limited to setting up as dual boot. In our previous video, we simply did a clean installation. There was nothing on the hard drive. There was no operating system there whatsoever. But what if you needed to install Windows 7 on a system that was already running an operating system and you wanted to have them both available to you at the same time? And you can make the decision when you're booting up, should I boot into my original operating system or should I boot into Windows 7? We call this dual booting because you'll be most of the time doing this with two separate operating systems, but really you could boot to many different operating systems on the same computer. In our situation today, the configuration that I've set up is a Windows XP machine. We're going to install Windows 7 along with that Microsoft Windows XP and be able to dual boot between those two. Although we will have two separate operating systems on the computer, one thing to keep in mind is you can obviously only run one operating system at a time. When you boot up, you'll get a message that says, which operating system would you like to start? And you get to choose right during the boot process which one that is. To have this dual boot process work properly, we're going to need a separate partition for each operating system. Now, there are some exceptions to this that we'll talk about in a moment, but generally this is how you do it whenever you're working with any dual boot configuration, because you could be dual booting between Windows XP, Windows Vista, Windows 7, and maybe even a Linux version. You can have a very complex configuration on your computer. Having them in separate partitions is really the easiest way to go about doing this. For Windows 7, this means that we'll need at least 15 gigabytes of free space available on that partition, and this can be either on the exact same drive as your existing operating system, or it can be on a separate physical disk inside of that same computer. It really doesn't matter. If you're running Windows XP already and you're using the entire partition, maybe you've got a 100 gig hard drive and all 100 gig are allocated towards Windows XP, well, that doesn't leave you any extra room for another operating system. So you may have to resize that partition. There are some third-party utilities you can get that can take that partition and shrink it down into a smaller size that would free up some free space for another operating system. In Windows Vista and Windows 7, this can be done in disk management, but we're running Windows XP today, and I actually had to go into my Windows XP partition and shrink it down, and I couldn't do that without using a third-party utility. I chose Ultimate Boot CD, and that's a fantastic resource if you're looking for a really nice boot CD that's got a lot of functionality in it. And these are all free and GPL and other type of freeware utilities. So it doesn't cost anything for this Ultimate Boot CD. Now, one capability in Microsoft Windows 7 is this capability called a virtual hard drive. I've abbreviated it here too. If you install to a VHD, you won't need another partition. Virtualization is built into the operating system with Windows 7. And if you are running Windows 7 Ultimate, you can use this VHD and you can boot from it, which means that you simply store it as a file that's on your existing partition, and you tell Windows 7 Bootloader when it boots up, go boot from that VHD, and it treats that as if it was a separate disk with its separate partitions. Pretty nifty. We're going to use some VHDs and work with VHDs in a future video, and it's in this section we're going to work with those. We're not going to deal with VHDs in this configuration. I'll simply show you how to do a dual boot on any other operating system where you won't be using VHDs. For those of you that have followed along with our course so far, you know that I make extensive use of virtualization. I'm using Oracle VirtualBox to do this. I have started up a system that I call my control room system. It is a system that has a 30 gig hard drive on it, and it's running Windows XP. I resized that partition for Windows XP, though, down to 5 gigabytes in size. So I've got another 25 gig on this disk that is a completely blank and open and available system. It's not even partitioned yet. So that will be perfect to put Windows 7 on in a dual boot configuration. And I have virtually put my Windows 7 Professional ISO DVD-ROM right into the DVD holder. In fact, here's my Windows XP that's already running back there. I'm going to log on, and I'm going to show you the size of the disk that I have here, and I'm going to give you a feel for what's in the system. Let's just go to Explorer, and we'll look at it right there. You can see on this computer, I do have a 5 gig partition set up for my Windows XP. There's 3.72 gig of free space available on there. And I also have a Windows 7 DVD in here. Now, my Windows XP system is one that is not really up to date. This is a really poor Windows XP system, and I know that because if I try to start that Windows 7, it says that you're not running Windows XP with Service Pack 2 on it. You're going to need Service Pack 2 if you want to launch this from inside of Windows XP. Otherwise, you're going to need to shut down your system and start this Windows 7 installation during the boot process. So instead of loading up Windows XP on here with Service Pack 2, what I'm going to do is shut down this particular virtual machine, restart it, and launch from the CD/DVD drive. When we restart, we're going to get an option that says press any key to boot from the CD or DVD, which is exactly what I'd like to do. Slide this back over to this screen so you can see what's going on here. Windows is loading the files. It's going through the normal boot process when it's booting directly from the DVD drive that's in the system. If you recall our previous video where we did a clean install of Windows 7, this starts exactly the same way, asking for language and currency and keyboard format. And we're going to click Install Now, just as we did before with a clean installation. Setup is starting up, and then we're going to get some prompts as to what we can do with Windows 7. We'll start with our end user license agreement. I agree to those license terms. And now we're opted to upgrade our existing version of Windows, which we know we can't do because that's running Windows XP. We have another option here, which is install a new copy of Windows. And that's what we'd like to do. It does give you a warning that says this does not keep your file settings and programs. But in our particular case, we're going to be installing this to a brand new partition. We don't have to worry about our old Windows XP because it will still be there. We're not going to touch anything with that. And you can see it asks where you would like to install Windows. I have a partition 1 that has my 5 gig Windows XP. Now notice that it doesn't have it on here anywhere what's on that partition. You have to already know that there is an operating system on that partition, and you need to be sure that you do not install Windows onto that partition. I'm going to choose this unallocated space, this 25 gig of extra space on that drive, and we'll click Next. And now Windows goes through the process of loading up all of the files, installing everything. It'll reboot during this process and begin a normal clean install of Windows 7, except it's installing it now onto a separate partition. One thing that will be different, though, when this does boot up is you're going to get a new selection in the bootloader. With a clean install of Windows, it didn't even prompt us when starting up. Once it's done with the installation here, we're going to have some options where we'll be able to choose to start in Windows XP or start in our new Windows 7 partition. When the installation is complete, you'll see a boot manager like this that is counting down from 30 that says, would you like to start an earlier version of Windows or would you like to start Windows 7? And there are other options that we can investigate in here, but we'll just simply let this count down and see if our Windows 7 installation worked well. And here's our Windows 7 out-of-box experience. It's been configured for us and it's simply asking for a username. And since this is a fresh installation, it's simply on another partition. It didn't migrate anything. It did not upgrade anything. This is a brand new and fresh, so we must tell it everything. Our username, and I'll simply keep the defaults in here, and then a password and a password hint, and I'm just going to type the word hint in there, and then the product key information that you'll need to qualify this version of Windows 7. This is the same thing you went through in the clean install of Windows. We'll use some recommended settings. We'll make sure that our date and time is correct in case we'd like to use this partition of Windows for something else. And I'll make sure that my times are set correctly on here. I'm not exactly sure what time it really is. I probably should get that right. There we go. And Windows 7 is starting up. So now we have two operating systems. We have a Windows XP and we have a Windows 7. Let's have a look to see exactly what happened during that installation process. Let's have a look in our Windows configuration of exactly what's going on here. I'm going to go into my administrative tools. I choose large icons for this because it'll be in alphabetical order and we can find things a little quicker. I'm going to go into my computer management and let's look to see exactly how the disk configuration ended up for this single 30 gig drive that I have in here. So here are the disks that we ended up with in our system. We have a single 30 gig physical drive, and on that are two NTFS partitions, one that is a 25 gig NTFS partition. It is healthy, it's a boot, has a page file, there's crash dump primary partition. This is our Windows 7 system, and there's another drive in here that currently is accessible via a drive D. We did not boot to that drive. That is also active primary partition. You can see that both of these coexist, but they are separated. That's the idea of dual boot. Let's shut down our Windows 7 and see if we can get back into Windows XP without any problems. What should happen every time when we boot up our system is we're going to get that Windows Boot Manager. So we will have the choice whenever this boots up. Let me move this around to this screen so you can see it. On a dual monitor display here, so it moves things around. I can choose earlier version of Windows or Windows 7. You'll notice when I touched a key there, the Windows Boot Manager stopped its countdown process, so you can go through and figure some of these things out. There are other options available for Windows 7. You can have F8 to look at more advanced capabilities. If you need to recover, you need to have the system go back to a previous version. You've also got this earlier version of Windows. We're simply going to hit enter there and see if we can start up our Windows XP partition. We got our Windows XP splash screen, so already we should feel pretty good about what we're seeing with Windows XP. And it looks like our system's booting perfectly normally, doing exactly what we would expect it to do on the system. We get our login, and there we are at our desktop. So nothing changed with Windows XP. In fact, if we do the same thing we did in our Windows 7, we'll go to our administrative tools into our computer management, and we'll see what the changes are from Windows XP perspective. We'll choose disk management, and there they are, our 5 gig and our 25 gig partitions. And it's C and E in Windows because I already had a D drive in Windows XP. And when the E drive still has information on it, we could go out to the E drive, make changes to it. Just have to remember that the information that's there is all going to be Windows 7 related. So we still have access to that data. We simply haven't booted from that partition. One of the things that you may recall from some of our previous installations of Windows 7 is that there was a 100 meg partition created, and then Windows 7 was put into the rest of the hard drive. You'll notice that didn't occur in this installation. That smaller 100 megabyte partition is called the Windows Recovery Environment, WinRE. And it's nice to have that there because if you do run into problems with the operating system, you can simply start the Windows recovery environment right from the hard drive. You don't have to have the Windows media to be able to get to some of those very useful recovery tools. Very nice insurance policy to have on your system. Now you can create a separate partition and manually install those recovery environment files if you'd like to, and it's not a bad idea to go about doing that. In a configuration like we did this time, however, you'll notice that we didn't have any space left over, so you may need to adjust some of the room on your hard drive, create another 100 megabyte partition and install that. There are plenty of instructions of how to do that on the Microsoft Windows website. This is going to be useful to have, so if you have a system that doesn't have that recovery environment on there, just make sure that you have that installation CD or DVD so that you can at least start those up if you ever might need them. The Windows Boot Manager that we were using before showed us that we were using a previous version of Windows and Windows 7. We might want to make some changes to that boot manager though. We might want to change the timeout. We might want to give it a more descriptive name. There are a number of things we can do with that. If you go to Windows 7 under your control panel under System, there are advanced system settings, and under Startup and Recovery, you can change the settings for the startup process. You can change what the default operating system is, the time that you'll list the operating systems, and you can make changes to the way it does things during that startup process. Let's look at it on my Windows 7 system. Here's the system that we just created. I'm going to go to our Start menu and in the control panel, under our system configuration, scroll down a little bit, there's system, and under our advanced system settings, you'll notice that we have an option here for startup and recovery. I'm going to simply use the settings, and here it is. We've got the option of earlier version of Windows, and we have the option of Windows 7. And we can change exactly what we'd like to do for the timeout. There's 30 seconds. You can also spend the time to display recovery options when needed for up to 30 seconds. You can always add that in if you'd like to. Now, I don't want to make a change in here, and I'd like to actually make some other additional changes to earlier version of Windows. It's not a great name. Maybe I'd like to go back to calling it Windows XP. But you'll notice there's nowhere in here to edit that information. In previous versions of Windows, you use something called a boot.ini file on the root of a drive. But if you've gone into Windows 7, you'll notice that isn't there anymore. There's no longer a boot.ini. So how do you work on configuring that? You use something called Bcdedit. That's the boot configuration data store editor. And that's going to edit a file that's boot/bcd. It's a hidden partition information. It's something that is not available to you. It's during that boot process we see it, so it's not part of Windows 7, but we can edit that file from Windows 7 using Bcdedit. Let's try that. To use Bcdedit, you need to be at an elevated prompt. You need to have administrator access in that prompt. You can't simply use your normal command line prompt. It's not going to work for you. You could right mouse click once you type in CMD and run as administrator, or as a shortcut, you can simply type in CMD and choose Control Shift and Enter. That way you don't have to click your mouse more than you need to, and then choose that you would like to run this in that elevated prompt. And here we are in this view. To run Bcdedit, we'll simply type Bcdedit and hit enter. And let's look at what we have here. Let me scroll back up. And you can see at the very top we have information about the Windows Boot Manager. That's that boot manager that starts up. We could make changes to that. And you can see that it has a name, Windows Boot Manager, which we can change. It can show us that our display order is to be NT loader and current. And that's talking about an abbreviation that's here. The NT loader is referring to that Windows XP session. You'll see it referred to that way. And then you have current, which is the one that we're currently using, which in this case happens to be Windows 7. We can then refer to these boot areas with that shortcut name, which means that we don't have to type in these very long identifiers. These are universal identifiers. We call them GUIDs in Windows, which are globally unique identifiers. The reason that they have this very, very long string of letters and numbers, this hexadecimal view, is because we can name objects with that, and we can be relatively certain now that that object name isn't going to match something else. There's some randomization and other things that are put into that whenever these objects are named. So you can see that we've got the legacy bootloader right here, and there's the name, earlier version of Windows. It starts by going to the D partition and going to the NT loader path, all of those things that normally happen when you start Windows XP. And here's the Windows bootloader that starts up winload.exe for Windows 7, and the bootloader settings here are going to the C partition under Windows and running the different settings that way. If you'd like to see some of the options available to you, you can type Bcdedit and /, and you can see there are a lot of settings here that you can go through to use Bcdedit. And you want to be very careful about using this Bcdedit because you can make changes to the boot process and leave your system unable to boot. And then you'd have to go through the recovery tools to be able to get back into and edit this Bcdedit. But one of the advantages here is that Bcdedit can all be run at the command line, which means you can go to anyone's machine and even have some of these things run in a batch process. And this is something that we'll see throughout this entire training series, is all of these things that you can do in a graphical view, you also are able to do at a command line, because in many cases the command line becomes even more important because you're able to do a command line in almost any situation, a batch file, a recovery mode, or any other type of mode where you simply don't have access to the graphical front end. So Bcdedit will be one of those command line tools that's very, very useful to know. Here are some of the command line options for Bcdedit. For instance, here's a really, really useful one. Back up your Bcdedits, your BCD configuration using Bcdedit/export and then the name of the file you'd like to export this to. That way, if you make a change and that change doesn't work properly, you can simply run this import command to get everything back exactly the way it was before you started this process. You can create new entries. If you didn't want to change an existing entry, you simply wanted to copy it and then make changes to that one so you can test different settings. You can use this /copy and then use the shortcut of current inside the curly brackets and then put a description in of new entry. There's other things we can do. For instance, we can set the description, new entry description. We can change the display order. We can change what the default option will be whenever it times out. What is it going to use? And you can also refer to these not just with the shortcut name, but also the globally unique identifier, the GUID, and see if you can change some of the options in there. In some cases, that's the only way you may be able to refer to some of these options is with that ID. So make sure you're very accustomed to copying and pasting inside of that CMD window. Let's use this one. Let's change the Bcdedit and set the description on that Windows so that it comes up and shows Windows XP rather than that previous Windows version. Let's look at the configuration of our system again. We'll type Bcdedit. And the one that I would like to change, the identifier that I would like to change is the one that's identified as Untitled. It's not the one that's identified as current. I want to change this one because that one has the description of earlier version of Windows. That's the one I want to make updates to. If there were other options in here, it may not have any of these shortcut names. It may be that very long globally unique identifier. It's nice that we have that shortcut because I'm going to use it in this Bcdedit configuration here. I'm going to use the /set command and I'm going to refer to the exact object, the identifier that I would like to set. The command line prompt that I'm going to use is description, and then in quotations I'm going to put what I would actually like to call this, which is Windows XP, and then close the quotes and hit enter. It says the operation completed successfully. Let's run Bcdedit again and see if it really does. And you can see my description for that partition and under that identifier, Untitled, now says Windows XP. Let's see if that really worked. And here are the results of the change that we made. Windows 7 is still the default. We didn't change that, but you can see the name that was here that did say the previous version of Windows now has a more specifically named Windows XP. So become accustomed to using those Bcdedit commands. They'll be very useful for you. Try copying some of these configurations, make change to where they're going, export them, import them so that you know how to back them up and restore them again. Those are very, very powerful commands, and you'll run into them a lot if you're going to be using this Windows Boot Manager. Let's see what we've learned in this episode. Which option should you choose to configure a dual boot configuration? Well, if you remember during our setup process, that option was the advanced option. We don't want to choose the upgrade. We actually want to install a brand new version of Windows 7. The next question is, which utility allows you to configure the boot menu from the command line? And if you recall, we were changing that Windows Boot Manager using Bcdedit. And the last question, what is the minimum partition size required to install Windows 7? We saw that earlier in the presentation. Before we did our installation, Windows 7 needs at least 15 gigabytes of space to be able to install properly. That covers the requirements for this module. We've gone through and done a dual boot installation. It worked perfectly, and we're now running Windows XP and Windows 7 on the same system and deciding which one to run when we boot the system up. If you'd like to watch any of our absolutely free Microsoft Windows certification videos, you'd like to participate in our message boards or much more, you can visit our website at ProfessorMesser.com.